Hello everyone, today among our extravagantes, discourses, we will address indirectly, the role of the laboratores in the early, but towards the high Middle Ages in chronological perspective, which is one of those, social history topics that, however, here we have to frame a bit in a, higher guise. And that refers to the important structural, we can use this without being structuralistic, of course, function and relevance and even foundational, like in a strictly material point of view of the, and prevalently so, of course, of the peasantry, of the workers, in that system that we've been describing often in also recent videos regarding the contraction truly coming from the end of antiquity, that sort of stagnation that really lasted not more than a century and a half, like in most parts of Western Europe, and that eventually would make the system boom in the High Middle Ages, especially starting from the 10th century. Naturally, I already made videos on medieval peasantry, the agricultural history, like the history of the countryside. I think it is actually very interesting and important topics. You know that I'm not a historian of society nor of economy, and of course my interest lays primarily in politics, in warfare, right? But as we know, Clausewitzianly, we cannot do without society either. And especially in this sort of mass contribution, aside from the scarce quality of the individual one, that after all was the fuel that allowed the elite, the establishment, to actually carry out that incredible feat, right, of literally making the West booming in a way that I honestly haven't seen, like in relation to the actual economical potentials in any other time in history. That is to say, of course, that the rates of growth at the time were not ridiculous compared to ours, but it doesn't make sense to compare them like that. And aside from the fact that we come on top of that, people's work wouldn't be here, the growth, the impact of such performance is really never to be seen in other times in history, also because of the immense civilizational, load that was expressed by the same. And it's really difficult at times to see this. Actually, like in, medieval historiography, this growth is one of the most important themes, right? It's often not framed at all in this broader moral and political and cultural aspect. It's mostly just, again, the structuralists from essentially a Marxian but not Marxist background, mostly studying just the socioeconomics as if nothing else was on the horizon, and were there to be, like, it would just be subordinated to whatever, I don't know, how much did a cow cost, right, in a 9th century market at Similia, right? And it's also very localistic history, which actually is a very lame way to make history. Like, we mock so-called micro-history, which is actually a terrible term. I would never use it myself. But there is no doubt that you cannot, of course, understand literally anything about any people whatsoever if you don't consider essentially the global reality, because of course you don't have any terms of comparison. In fact, that's something that is profoundly disturbing as anti-traditional when people fixate selectively just on their own people, as that's the first indicator that they literally do not know anything about the history of their own people. And this is actually very, very common, especially among the fourth estaters in the lower strata, and that's also part of, unfortunately, like in fact, a properly nationalist and socialist together, because they also cannot really exist without one another. But don't tell the, don't tell them, because they think, at least from the nationalist side, that they are actually traditionalists, and they don't even know where to begin with that. But I will not follow that path in this video, telling the truth. I would like to frame this topic rather in within the broader background of the demographic regrowth, like the agrarian expansion, mercantile activity, all topics that, of course, we already discussed profusely, but it's really relevant to every once in a while come back on it. This is just like a general thought, right? Some videos are much more analytical, and I give you data, names, places, technical terms, etc. This is a bit more conceptual. Every once in a while I do this. Because we must learn, as I was saying, to understand the Middle Ages and history in general in these more, say, long-range fashion, that, especially regarding the aforementioned boom of the West, very often gets neglected, because, again, even if everybody has heard of the rebirth of the year 1000, this is often narrated as, there was this lame situation in which everybody was starving to death and there was nothing, nobody read, there was stench everywhere, that just lived in huts and villages, there were no cities, there were no traffics, there was nothing, there's just some fat rich bastards sitting on a pile of gold or laughing sadistically over the peasants breaking their backs in the fields, similar things. And then, there is the revival of the year 1000, that is really of the year 900, if we were to, as we were saying before, like actually saying it in the accurate way. But, of course, there had been a previous growth before, right, especially in some countries. And aside from that, like this, it's better than nothing, like they began to, which is also false, by the way, they began to introduce new techniques and tools, and so that kind of improved, but minimally, and it all sucked. And they don't get in all of this the actually broader picture of the West literally booming and taking over, like, the entire surroundings, politically, culturally, morally, religiously, technically, also, like the history of, say, material history is important. It's not to be avoided. It's complementary, really, to the spirit. And you see, that's also how the narrative is. Like, when they teach you the Crusades, it's kind of the Crusades, but, then the other chapter is a bit on Spain under a conquest, and then, there were kind of the Baltic. They don't glue them together. They don't especially show you from the within, from the proper bowels of post-Carolingian Europe, how this system compacted in a hardcore way compared to what the surroundings were really about, and also the long term. Like, this is a huge tide that basically it does take some time. The Latin Germanic system had taken forever before to restart. Like, not even that forever, as we've seen, but I mean, its statal systems had been sort of slower to develop because they had been actually being engineered and sort of provided with that glue, actually, like in a more effective way. And when this thing kicks in, when the momentum reaches its peak, this thing keeps going on, keeps overflowing all around. And that's also why we make the history of the single countries at a point, because one could say it also from this general perspective, but also lacking how it was also happening locally. So the two things must always get together. Like, you can't pick the Middle Ages just for that kind of objectively pathetic and patheticistic almost approach to, oh my God, life was so hard. Let's see what were the most horrible tortures of the most evil popes of the Middle Ages. Like, this is only, like, I will not say where specifically this mentality comes from. It's a very precise one, but I don't know how to say that. That's not how on history books, even fortunately, even the countries where these things are set, like the Middle Ages is, like, even basic university manuals the Middle Ages are thought like, even remotely, like, and not because, say, those are cliches that are kind of true, because those are not things, right? That is for mentally disturbed people without education, and objectively nobody should care about them. They should care about themselves first and foremost. But the point overall is that the Middle Ages is so amazing in this, right? In not this sort of relativistically perspective idea of the same or the difficulties, right? But what actually these polities managed to accomplish in a sort of macroscopic and also universal way, which is like, if that we were talking about some place in the second world that is complex and paranoid, I would immediately have already, used to say we were the best of all, whatever. And that in the West, we inexplicably, like, fortunately, like, of course, we are incredibly confident in, at least for those who approach these topics, like, we feel the Middle Ages being, in general, like, a cool thing, right? So we don't have too much guilt trip about that. I mean, guilt trips are for weak people, and we don't care about them either. And from the other side, in the underdeveloped countries, you have people who are ashamed of themselves. In that sense, they are even, right, actually. But I mean, really, the sense of, like, the greatness of medieval civilization and Western civilization in comparison, essentially, to it, especially its surroundings. Like, the only sort of similarly scaled thing was China. It wasn't really like any other remote competitor, and even China actually wasn't that better of a place compared to Europe at all. And actually I also have a great respect for that China, of course. And we will hopefully make more videos, in fact, on medieval Chinese history at some point. But again, the point I want to make today is really simple. Not banal, but so simple you say, oh, seriously, it's this one? Yeah, because in fact it's not banal, and it should be thought, say, to objectivize the fundamentals of what we're referring to here. First of all, there is a concept which also may sound banal, but it's really not. Like, how complexly advanced late medieval Europe really was, and especially in comparison to what early medieval Europe had seemingly been, right? And of course also compared to the ancient one. And we will see in other videos how this path actually follows, also in that long-range perspective, in the West, a specific internal logic. I mean, so naturally it wasn't like just planned, at the beginning of the Middle Ages, like a, goal, but you can argue that, of course, there was a hope to repristinate the older unitary Catholic order. So that was intrinsic, like it's intrinsic in any civilization, telling the truth. But the way, in fact, it sort of blossomed and systematized itself and organized itself is objectively insane, right? It's of a scale of complexity, a level of robustness that, again, you can't really quite see everywhere. And think about this when you underestimate, as we all tend to do to some degree, the early Middle Ages. I will not digress on the concept that, yes, this depends also some national approaches, because we have been influenced also by international approaches in this, and we tend not to see how actually many places, namely the ones that had belonged to the Roman Empire, especially toward the Mediterranean, how advanced they had remained, how that sort of idea of collapse, of course, had not been so tragic as it's usually portrayed. And of course, it's obvious that there were other parts of Europe were much less developed, but we shouldn't graft our own sort of collective imagery. Unfortunately, pop culture is very unhelpful in this, model on that basis. And that's not an exception. That's not the sort of statistic saying, oh, but there were other places that were advanced, and they send you picking them in, thousands of kilometers away from Europe. No, we're talking within the same Europe, and also pretty notoriously to anyone who has actually like a solid, at least, medieval historical note. But we've seen them often. To some degree, it's one of the leitmotifs of Schwerpunkt. There is, and I will insist on this more in other videos because we have still to properly eviscerate this and polish it further. The concept, right, of the emergence, the hegemonic tendency of a military and ecclesiastical aristocracy coming to manage this process, and that after the aforementioned few centuries of somehow difficult functioning within a more or less, unstable political royal system, sort of temperated by Germanic clientele tradition and territorial systems of Mediterranean origin, ended up with sort of remolding the entire system to their own image, right? I would like to point out, as we did most of the times, that this was a truly Latin Germanic elite. They had properly stemmed from, again, the military aristocracy of the Germanic conquerors and the senatorial episcopal establishment of the Roman world. And there was a lot of stuff into it, because already the Roman world was differentiated enough. Like it was, for example, a Celtic substratum. Historically, there was, in many ways, it had remained French. The system had mostly been Latinized. But we're talking about, like, in fact, these, even as an outcome, right, of the migration here in the early Middle Ages, the sort of consolidation, like this after, of course, the collapse of the empire, which was, in that sense, not a positive thing, but say, at least, right, the system saved itself by breaking up into smaller political, territorial entities that would essentially organize themselves within, say, multiple spheres of mostly estates-based domination, right? This is particularly important because that's where you start seeing properly like a Gallic power, an Hispanic power, an Italian power, and of course this was more complex, but in this sense, entering in dialogue with one another, there was a lot in terms of, as we've seen, the pre-existing, for example, literary, administrative, urban culture of the Roman world, and for example, the recognition, international recognition of the importance of the Germanic elites after the migrations, and the fact that these were now commanding a sort of what was being recognized as a sort of a shared background from both the Roman and the Germanic origin. And of course, like we talked so much about these various systems, the Franks, the Goths, the Longobards, the Anglo-Saxons, and more. You, of course, realize that this territorialization, as we were pointing out before, had stemmed from the collapse of a more unitary system that had been attempted to preserve, and that sort of kind of holds like that's why we'll talk about the laboratores now, because essentially the peasantry had been exhausted, literally. This is the moment in which, as we've seen properly, there is now this military and ecclesiastical elite that sort of stands out. It is true that in late antiquity this sort of the system already existed, but in a, say, oligarchic, aristocratic fashion. But in fact, this is truly mostly an aristocratic one, only because the system is fragmented to the point that it's rare to find like just the enormous land estate ownership that, like in Roman times, was really extreme. Like you had single senatorial families controlling latifundia across like the Mediterranean, different regions at a time. So at this point, it sort of shrinks to instead some regional dimension, which is still pretty big, especially in Gaul and Spain. But that, of course, everywhere still revolves around land ownership and, say, the exhaustion, say, of actually the ownership of large estates by the kind of this aristocracy, and the exhaustion, basically, of the rest of the inhabitants who had come to be subjected in one another to these elite. And of course, there were more peripheral areas or areas in which wealth was more evenly distributed. However, the basics of the system functions pretty much everywhere, all over like the post-Western half of the Roman Empire, right? The Byzantines actually get sort of, especially after the Islamic invasions, like the loss of half of its territory was broken down in similar ways, but at least there was a single government and state, had preserved effectively a truly monocentric and sort of large estate-based system, with increasingly sclerotized towards the later Middle Ages towards that direction, whereas Europe had been habituated with a very different dynamic. Then, yes, of course, there were some fringe areas in which, in fact, state, the various Romano-Germanic kingdoms had also very loose. Sometimes they neither existed. Like look at Anglo-Saxon Britain, for example. At least until the 10th century, it's still with sort of more graduality, because of course it's Northern Europe. It's sort of less populated, less urbanized. It's colder. Like that affects agriculture, and so it takes a longer time, right? And some areas are just like sort of living on their own, right? Think about Brittany. Think about the Basques. Think about, like, there are this kind of limited situations, and eventually, say the core remains intact around like a monarchy in most regions. But there are also tragic outcomes, like the Islamic conquest of the Visigothic kingdom. And there are some cycles of expansion, recollapse is especially evident among the Franks, etc. So every country has its own deal, but we can't avoid to look at the Latin Germanic system within Christian Europe and say, okay, this is literally the basis from which, say, most of it rebooted and started kicking back again. And so that's where you want to appreciate the role of the laboratores, right? Because the output of the system, of course, down the line, rested on these people that were in turn supporting the elite, defending them, preserving them, more or less in the same function dynamically throughout this entire period. Right, this before, after the Carolingian Empire, of course, there were different degrees, different quantities of this, but it was all pretty much the same. And this is the point, like, why the laboratores? Because the logic of this development, this incredible development, couldn't sort of realize itself in a, say, abstractly autonomous fashion compared to the wider frame and the more general development of the living conditions of the populations, right? My channel is very much like anti-classist, anti-fourth estate, anti-ignorance, anti-accomplishment, and whatever, but this doesn't mean at all that, of course, I don't have an enormous respect and admiration, and just for the average anthropic type, like that, of course, silently and mostly, in fact, in a tragically undocumented way, was silently pulling the car, right? And of course, there weren't angels, there weren't perfect people, there weren't people that, at the time especially, could be considered, in fact, by the elite that had other standards, but definitely compared to a 21st century person, that is disgustingly spoiled, even in the single poorest places in the world, that has nothing to do in a systemic way with how people had to live at the time, and probably in the moral frames. This is not much of a matter of being disadvantaged. This is about probably the existential condition in a metaphysical sense, considering what had just happened, by the way, with the collapse of great part of the Catholic unity and the exhaustion of the system, the sort of mental trip downwards, like spiraling down from the fracture between the overlapping temporal and spiritual power, and the same fragmentation of the system to these various chunks that were able to individually, surely, to provide stability. Also because energies had been exhausted, and Western Europe as a whole does not get really too much harassed after the migration era that among us ends earlier, right? And if you look at Central Europe, especially Eastern Europe, like it's a bit of a different thing, of course. And of course, also Northern Europe was very unstable, especially in Scandinavia. So that there were a lot of things going on. But if you look at, again, the major Romano-Germanic dominions, you realize that overall these people had it in a more stable way. I mean, even in Spain with the Arabs, these guys take over, and there is some statal stability that, to a degree, hadn't even existed in the Visigothic system, but there were also worse things in exchange for that. And so that's that axis that is Gaul, Italy, and Britain to gradually, also Germany gradually expanding as the consolidation of the Rhineland, of the Danubian area, and of course also the Byzantines were capable of preserving that, as we've seen, order. They sort of locked down, literally in a broader, say, metaphysical, cultural, say, mental sense, and that was very useful defending. But then there was some problem there, but sort of rebooting in the same way the Westerners did. Some differences, not entire. Of course, the Byzantines would have important and successful comebacks at a massive level. It's not to say that they didn't contribute in that. Again, I try to provoke you sometimes, to provide you with specific. It is not to say that what I say is not true, or it's meant to trick you at all. But I provoke you because about those differences that in many ways are not seen, and that I think are not really set out there. You may not find. I try to balance every statement of mine through what I see around. Like, if something is not said, it's not pointed out, then it's relevant. You should calibrate its explanation, its description, its mention accordingly, right? So that this channel can hopefully get somewhere in terms of positive capacity, let's say. There are so many different shades and details, like it's sort of characteristic. Every system is different, but you can sort of group them and generally along some. It's equally obvious that the history of power and of the aristocracy cannot take on a meaning that can be extracted from those that, in fact, lived through, like even were subjected to such leadership, and rendered it possible with their participation and or acquiescence, which is obvious. As we always say, like every government exists because of the size of moral support of the people, which means that it can be even a minimal one, right? This was not the case. It was a true cooperation. Just the other day made a video that was actually talking about this, especially for the post-Carolingian era. It's true that in early medieval times it had been slightly different list there were lots of populations that were more autonomous, but in this sense also less organized. At least there had been an exhaustion of resources, but also of threats. So there were less people, there was more land, sort of weaker governments, and so things were not easier. Telling the truth, like individually, like in fact there is more land doesn't mean that you can romantically go out there somewhere and creating your own farm and living there with everything you need. No, it's a nightmare to say the least, right? And of course the system is dramatically more stable a couple of centuries later, at least properly down the peasant level. Of course, were wars that would concentrate their devastating effects here and there, but this was also possible because there was a greater availability of resources, moral and material alike, that were coming from the same laboratores. So this in perspective that participated in this. And again, this was not, was a poor system. We should stress like the material poverty especially, but we don't have we don't have to think that the early Middle Ages were a wasteland, or that there's just like the pauperistic sort of version, the post nuclear apocalypse kind of, no, right? We know less about the system, which is alone as a datum quite telling, of course, about their level of development. But when you scratch beneath the surface of that few that you can grasp from the sources, you realize that actually these were big, complex, dynamic systems, and that they would have that these people would have been sort of surprised to know what we think of the so-called Dark Ages, right? That are dark exclusively because of the lack of documentation and not because of other reasons. Again, then things were terrible in general. Like you would have not liked to live there, but compared to other times, it wasn't even such an enormously bad time to leave. And again, don't make the mistake either of depreciating what came afterwards of what existed before, because somebody has told you that the paranoid alienation from reality, bailing out of civilization because you fail in it, and going to wanting just to live forever at the margins of civilization in a hut is the way of living, right? Properly in the traditional doctrine, even the warrior has to spend some sort of ascetic time in his existence that is also ascetical in very violent ways, telling the truth, not just being out there in the world. I'm talking military initiation, not again just fighting animals or something like that. Also that, but that is part sometimes. That's a metaphor for actual war banders, etc. That pitied. It depends really, but eventually the military elite, especially in the early Middle Ages, as we've seen, were ruling, right? So the peasants were considered less at this point in the stage. Yes, there had, because I was referring to some passages like the berserkers living as outcasts. I made a video about this, this would happen before and later, but in different situations where the peasants basically chased them away, treated them like actual animals, gave them to eat, like what they would give to, in fact, random wolves revolving around villages and so on. But again, I made couple of videos on that topic, and I'm way more accurate there. Now we were not descending to that, but the point I was making is that yes, there was no paradise, was no place we should revert to, or some places of higher, power that is truly the one that traditionally serves the purpose. So you can be more morally sensitive, you can be sort of individually readier, but that's not what is going, without results that is going to tell you how worthy you really are. So don't make that mistake. It was an incredibly miserable reality, beyond the comparison with ourselves, right? That are less in many other ways, and most ways, of course, but most moral ones. So there are different ideas about this that can be summarized, for example, from a military point of view, like the creation of that mounted elite, its development, the enormous costs of maintaining a war horse, producing just arms and armor, and especially having an elite specializing just for warfare and being sustained, like training for throughout the entire existence, and having, as we've seen, like also a spiritual guidance that had to be fostered by studies by people, so that had to spend like a contemplative life maintained by somebody else. Like this all had to do with, in part, the Indo-European tripartite order. We've seen this recently in the video about the Roman Comitia, that and the original organization right, of the tribus, the tribe, that literally stemmed from that tripartition, like of the warriors, the priests, and the workers, the laboratores, in fact. And so this is, to be understood in much deeper ways than just the historical one, topologically, religiously. Today we don't talk specifically about that, but it's important to highlight how to, just because these civilizations were developing after all, that these communities successfully expanded under this establishment, that the populations subjected to the elite were supported, were okay with that, were positive. They gave green light, right? And again, this is unequivocal, right? The entire narrative of the rebel that fights against the evil empire, it's all a pile of BS, like in the best case scenario. It does not match with any historical, anthropological, again, religious evidence whatsoever. It's an anti-evolutionary principle, first of all. And even though, of course, like the fringe must be rebellious and heretical and crazy and, that sort of disgusting, like leftism really shows you, because it has to provoke the, say, the orthodoxy, the center, the majority, because otherwise that would sclerotize as well. This is all normal. This is absolutely nothing to do with the notion that was ever a society in which, like, there were some anarchic, prosperously anarchic individuals who were living free and succeeding and being powerful, and so that there was the evil guy who came to rule over them, and whoever ruled is an expression of the people, like entirely. You can't say anything. Like, it doesn't matter whether you support that or not. Just the mere fact that you're not out there putting bombs trying to create a revolution tells you that you're letting that happen, right? That's what in the Catholic existential metaphysical condition humanity finds itself like to operate like. It's that you could do that, or you could, if you have if you wonder why all those wars were being fought in general in the history of mankind, that's exactly because somebody who had the actual power and the support, because they had sort of better ideas, had enough following and support to actually try to come at the top. But in many ways it was all about the top. It was about the hierarchy, it was about the system. It was never like a culture, society of people that were living out there alone, scattered and free and happy. It doesn't exist, right? We know that this is not a thing. Like the fall from heaven is an elite process, right? If at best you have the pre-Promethean masses that were already, say, part of the most miserable aspects of the fall, that roamed as savages, as brutes, as underdeveloped animals, and dirty, and humans, in fact, in the darkness, in the lack of technical capacity, in stupidity, and in unaccomplishment, which is also very similar, of course, to what humanity has remained by definition of the term etymologically humanity, which literally means dirty, like up to this point. But of course, that's up to the establishment to fix. And in this case, like, you can't have like a better example of, say, the balance that existed my opinion, in the Latin Germanic system. And then again, other systems were successful in their own ways. It's not to say that we here just to talk of how, let's say, how good and great like the Latin Germanic system was and the others did not exist. No, right? You know that we cover other systems, we give our due to everybody. We have to be historically objective in everything. But again, also objectively, there is a level of, say, what is the West and how did it come about and why was it so successful and why is it still the leader? Well, there is a reason, right? And if you want to understand it, it's evidently to be searched in the deeper roots of our history, not just in, I don't know, we invented steam engine, right? Or we, destroyed religion, but because that's not it. Like, if anything, it's the opposite. And and we still live by the standards, even if when formally or substantially there is an imbalance in that regard. So it's very stupid to despise the West, also because there isn't really anything better as an alternative. This is especially evident to this day, frankly. Like, it was really much easier to observe this today than to observe it historically, because it's a more complex and difficult thing. It's maybe just less evident. It's about habituating yourself to study a past that I understand also for many people is sort of insidious looking, because you don't know what some of you ask me, where do you get this stuff? Like, how do you come up with these ideas? How do you know this? Like, it takes time to learn stuff, and you must learn a lot of stuff, and then you will forget like 90% of that, but in the process, like, what remains as a mold, because you spotted some patterns, goes on. And as you know, I can throw about anecdotes and other stuff, but that's what we also do every day with video after video. It's a wall. It's just like we add attach it to this broader mosaic. It's just like a thread in a broader tapestry. You can't have one thing without the other, and this is the same point with the relation between the elite and the laboratores. Now, the unfortunate thing about the latter is that historically the sources available by scholars that intend to penetrate like this depth of the wider social strata of the time, in fact, for the early Middle Ages, are really very, very poor, right? And the capacity of analysis is incomparably more difficult than not for the revocation that is so approximate anyway of the activity of the hegemonic groups themselves. This aspect is also incredibly relevant, as we were saying before, when we look at the at societies of war. We understand that there were big systems, like there were millions of inhabitants in, say, the main Romano-Germanic kingdoms each. There was an important political and social complexity. We all understand this. The problem is that we do not really have any source telling us directly how the system was truly and practically organized. What were the mental frames of people? Like in the 14th century, you can read a novel and having a universe opening. So even if you don't know what peasants believed at the time either, but you can sort of guess. You have so many information, even just indirectly, that you can reconstruct so much, like from the most different kind of documents, even again that apparently having nothing to do specifically with the peasantry in this case. And naturally later on society was even more complex, so the laboratores were not typically, say, they were still overwhelmingly the peasants, and there wouldn't be much about it changing until industrial times. But in general, like the level of diversification in say, in society, in economy, in trade, in production in general, in the same agriculture, specialized crops, many different connections of the countryside with the ruling elite really leave their mark. Archaeology, unfortunately, for the early Middle Ages is not that telling because the traces are incredibly sparse. It costs a lot just to dig anywhere, and therefore you can't really have, in spite of the enormous amount of information that we derive from the discipline and the pretty substantial, useful one, really an overall picture. Of course, it's rare to find surprises. Surely there weren't unknown metropolises in Iceland, right? But that dynamism that floated, like even just at a Fort Estate level, rendering, like, allowing for the platform on which the establishment was able to develop the former further and to make everything more functional and rational and sort of effective. It's not clear, it's not there, it's not documentable, right? And for us, some of the most beautiful sources, of course, are the laws, right? We made some videos about the Germanic laws, the Romano-Germanic laws, and reading them really does tell you a lot. I mean, if you have that sort of inclination, that capacity of reading through, of being, of course, it takes a specific competence. It's not easy at all. Like, you can't simply open this but reading and rereading, just that, like habituating yourself to read something and reread it, and to stay focused on it, to have patience. This would be already a lot, right? They sort of restore you so much of that picture. It doesn't solve the problems that you would like nor it's going to simply, like, there are certain levels that cannot be simply passed, right? There are some things that unfortunately we know won't be discovered. We have to surrender to the evidence of the lack of evidence, and on that basis, however, gathering still all what we know and we can about any single element that can habituate you to think that. Because honestly, like I tell you, like even as a PhD, it's not like you know everything, but I mean, I know it's banal to say, but the point of getting there academically is not, again, knowing too much. It is having that capacity of in-depth analysis, of realizing from some indicators, few indicators, what certain things would be like, because you gained enough expertise at least about a specific time and place to be sensitive to that datum, right? And immediately, like when the new information comes about, you're able to frame it within the pregress system that you have in fact matured. And it's not like other historians are able to do so for your own time. At least it depends. Of course, there are people who study the same thing. I fortunately have a quite unspoiled field to research, and in that sense I do feel that even when great, say, professors talk to me and say, I don't think that is bad, I don't know, we have discussions, even from certain statements, right? You realize that they're simply not there. Like, they're trying to get there, maybe faking that they want to have some expertise, but they haven't. Why you have matured some sensitivity to a particular topic, and why you think that what you're saying immediately, it's sometimes even just a gut feeling, right? And it is supposed to be so. Let's stop with this absurdity that science is about just citing other people in chain. Where does it begin, right? It's about interpretation. It is a matter of authority, right? And authority must be earned on the field. As in Catholic tradition, if the idea is good, it makes sense, it's adopted, right? How do you think historiography works, by the way? Like it works actually much worse ways, because there are lots of other reasons why things can be eventually brought up and sort of accepted or refused. But it is really about your own sensitivity. It is really about your own work. It's really about that uniqueness that you can bring as an individual to the bigger picture, right? The reconstruction of our understanding, the picture of the truth that is out there, regardless of what people think about it or not, and that in fact we have the chance of coming closer to, right? Making it to more, say, relevant, more functional, like in a scientific and moral way. Like this is expandable in successfully. So, and I don't want to get starting even to decaying grammar when I start getting to the closer end of the video, but it's a thing. It's like, yeah, this is more or less what I wanted to tell you today, by the way. Like, there's not further space about the laboratores, etc., but just thinking about these people, like couple of months ago I had a sort of vision and thinking, like getting interested mostly in, as I was saying before, in not necessarily the elite, but say the key figures, like the most important dynamics. You don't study in that sense much of peasant history, right? But I don't even want to make the connection that those were our ancestors, or we actually had peasants as say even known ancestors much more recent times. It is about, yes, understanding them in this collective sense. I mean, in this against any classist interpretation, this functionality, this tripartite functionality, the idea that somebody must work, others must think, others must fight, and it's all intertwined. Like they're actually doing all the same thing. They just have their own individual path to it, which stems from the, of course, the capacity to understand your role in the system and wanting to be and to contribute to it in that orderly way. Again, that video I made recently on the convergence of the elite and the popular fort is incredibly important. It is incredibly connected with this idea, right? So it's not really a downside. The vision I had being, think about these people working the land, being connected to it, having to work because of the fallen condition, and still having their spirit looking at the skies, that like with the heavens, like this clouds, all the climates, the seas and the years passing, and this light above them passing by, and cyclically, and these men and women being under that and passing, right, and yet leaving like their offspring for the same cycle and going on and going towards a direction, and doing this for a specific purpose, for a specific reason, right? And knowing that that connection, knowing that that broader purpose that we seem to instead forget, there is an incredible, like, I don't know, emotion stemming from this, like thinking about this specific condition, and it's not, it's just something I envisioned for my consideration of those people in their force that I don't absolutely despise. On the contrary, the main problem being the comparison with today, which is in fact a completely different story. And you see how at the time the elite could have thought literally the same way, and as you know, they were quite discriminatory towards the peasantry, that were truly felt, even more at that time, as being the guys who had lost the actual power that they could have had, right? And that they said, was commuted with this just land working and subjection and dependency. According to tradition, we are all dependent. Right? The reason a person who is only God is independent and free. Nobody is. Like, there's just a different condition of liberty, rather, and not much more really. The point here is pretty much the same, right? And this was the thought. And then, of course, there can be many other ones, but we're not here to simply just look at it. I don't know, this is the last video, I think, before I'm getting 20,000 subscribers, so it's interesting to me. I have here how much, let me check. -5. Yeah, we get there overnight. And yeah, that's pretty much it. What to say? I wish I talked more and better about history, about these topics, about the way I sort of choose them, I categorize them, and more. Right? I care about this process, and we will hopefully do better over time. Naturally, there are many specificities about the laboratores, as as we've seen, there were different types of laboratores in different contexts. There were monks that were laboratores at the same time. There were some elites that were mercatores, for example. This is especially true during the early Middle Ages, right? So you always find a hybrid, right? For example, the monastic military order were warriors and priests to a degree at the same time, like in the broader sense of priesthood, of course. You had even again laboratores who bore arms, right, and that thus were militarily active, and this is incredibly important in this picture as well, because it shows you that in spite of the, say, relative social homogeneity that we're looking at, there wasn't really such a thing like a full homogeneity, like an equality, like something that you can simply divide into classes just per se, right? We'll have to talk, of course, also about the traditional doctrine of castes that technically still subsisted in this regard. I mean, there was a level of approximation for which we say, well, the system sort of changed over time, was not recognized, but actually, as I was just saying, there was a stigma about the same, again, like working the land, working in the first place. You see, traditionally, just slaves work. There's no such a thing like, a freeman who works. The freeman fights, right? The priests maintain themselves. There is it's always a form of imperium that is spotted, that is attributed, that is part of the fundamental, in fact, hierarchy, like quality that individuals have just by what they do and how they do it, etc. Like this is particularly relevant in general to appreciate in a historical sense, just as much as, again, things could be really mixed even in functions. And the Indo-European tripartite order is also to be, of course, conceptually understood and not denied, just understanding that, of course, the degree by which humanity is fallen brings to this different outcomes. So again, everybody has their own path back to the one, because we are all different. Right? So there are lots of things in common. Vector is the same, but the ways, the means, can and will really change. So this is, again, particularly important to understand better the rhythms of the laboratores, their actual path, and how they went along. There would be naturally, I made some playlists, by the way, about medieval peasantry, medieval countryside, and agriculture, and all this stuff. So we will surely increase. We talk about peasant revolts, right? So that's all a history that must be told, must be appreciated, and especially like talking about the countryside and its work, like it's how the world really was, right? Even just how it, say, were we to experience it from a 21st century, but probably very different perspective, what would strike us, how would we appreciate the enormous differences separating us from these people, but realizing that we are in the same condition after all, in a broader way, and that therefore also for them it wasn't just about being peasant, it was just about having to do that. There was a purpose, there was a belief, there was a degree of liberty, there was a degree of autonomy, a degree of violence and aggression, like the peasantry notorious. It was one of the most viciously violent element of the system. They were dangerous, they were rebellious, they weren't easy to deal with at all, right? And especially in the early Middle Ages, like in still again in the Middle Ages, the peasants had actually much more liberty than they would have notoriously in the early modern age. It was again properly a settlement. That is yet another topic that we insist very much in the later Middle Ages, that gets often overlooked, because again there is this sort of pauperistic complaint about, oh, look at the peasants, as if medieval peasants were the worst type of, would have had the worst type of living condition that we should just pity, right? And that starts from a wrong assumption, which excludes the spiritual dimension these people did have. Like the fact, again, that the word the chthonic element doesn't, the more chthonic element doesn't have anything to do with the fact that they had their own beliefs, that they had their own understanding of the Catholic question, and that I think we are prepotently underestimating. Yes, of course, there was a lot of misery also culturally and individually, but there was a sense within this traditional world of, in fact, what had happened to the world in the first place, and why they were peasant, for example. So that's yet another aspect which you wanna appreciate when you think of them, even if, as we've seen documentarily, we know so few about them. Would have had it even been possible to have a system in which just like the lower level thought just the opposite of the upper level? No, right? There can be no doubt about this, and the I think the general relevance here is it goes even beyond whatever. We should start. Okay, I don't think I will be making a new series about the peasantry or anything, but I hope that one day, because Schwerpunkt has no limits, there will be more attention also to this topic, to these people, and to the to the value that these individuals had, also for the sake of their freedom. Because if you think about it, the same Indo-European tripartite order does not contemplate the fourth estate, because essentially this was the order that the ruling that the establishment had to have. As we've seen, you could be a laborator if you were just even, for example, directing that work and dealing with it, as opposed to fighting or just having that contemplative life. So the fourth estate actually emerges means properly the slaves, means those who have been subjected because of their sin and their sin against God, the fact of being defeated, they're less, and they can be used for menial jobs as vocal instruments, as the Romans called them, and that's also something surviving at this point. This society has slavery, and it's less than it had been in the past. Gradually, the slavery truly is surpassed. Like, it depends and even serfdom in some areas is surpassed. I made multiple videos on this in the Middle Ages in that sense, and specific areas of Europe, the most advanced, actually do show the level of greater civilization equates actually better living standards. There is no doubt in when we talk about real civilization. So what the civic principle really means, not just being, it's just some abstract system, and what does civilization mean, right? But anyhow, I vowed that I inserted this later because I had made too short of a video and I wanted to dilute it a little bit before the end, but let's simply go with this. This is enough. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.